The afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot of the Fairview Shopping Center, a sprawling complex of big box stores and chain restaurants that had slowly strangled the life out of the old downtown. Heat rose from the asphalt in shimmering waves, warping the air around the rows of parked cars. Inside his truck, Terrence Washington sat for a moment, letting the air conditioning wash over him before stepping out into the furnace. His hands were still faintly stained from the morning's work, the faint gray tinge of drywall dust that never quite washed out no matter how hard he scrubbed it. He was a contractor, a good one, with a reputation for showing up on time and doing the job right. Today, though, he wasn't here for work. He was here for his son. Jordan was 12, all gangly limbs and sudden growth spurts, and he needed new sneakers for basketball camp. The old ones had blown out at the toe during a pickup game last weekend, and Terrence had promised to replace them before the first day of camp on Monday. This was his window. He had exactly 2 hours before he needed to pick up his daughter from her summer art program. He killed the engine, grabbed his wallet from the center console, and stepped out into the heat. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of humidity that made you feel like you were breathing through a wet cloth. He walked across the parking lot, his work boots crunching on bits of gravel, and pushed through the glass doors of the sporting goods store. The place was called Victory Sports, a regional chain that prided itself on outfitting every athlete from Pee-wee soccer players to weekend warriors. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying the faint chemical smell of new rubber and synthetic fabrics. Fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished concrete floors, and rows of merchandise stretched out in every direction, a colorful landscape of athletic aspiration. Terrence knew exactly what he was looking for. Jordan had been specific about the brand, the model, even the colorway. The kid had done his research, watched the YouTube reviews, saved his allowance money to contribute to the purchase. Terrence was proud of that, proud of the young man his son was becoming. He found the basketball shoe section easily enough, a wall of high tops and low tops arranged by brand. He scanned the shelves, his eyes searching for the familiar silhouette of the shoe Jordan wanted. He found it on the third shelf from the top, a sleek black and red design that looked like it belonged on the feet of a professional. He reached for the display shoe, turning it over in his hands to check the size. A 10.5. Perfect. He looked around for a sales associate, but the section was empty. No problem. He'd take the shoe to the front register and ask them to bring a pair from the back. He was about to turn away when he noticed a woman standing at the end of the aisle. She was middle-aged, with bottle blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and a face that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Her name tag identified her as Deborah. She was wearing the same navy blue polo shirt as every other employee in the store, but on her, it looked like a uniform of authority, a badge of some self-appointed importance. She wasn't just looking at him. She was studying him, her eyes narrow and calculating, her arms crossed over her chest. It was a look Terrence had seen 1,000 times before, a look that said she was already writing a story about him in her head, and it wasn't a flattering one. He ignored her, as he had learned to do over the years. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began walking toward the front of the store, the display shoe in his hand. He was a customer. He had money to spend. He had every right to be here. But as he walked, he could feel her eyes on his back, a persistent, prickling sensation that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He quickened his pace slightly, suddenly eager to complete his purchase and get out of this place. The checkout line was short, just one person ahead of him, a young mother trying to corral two toddlers while paying for a soccer ball. Terrence waited patiently, his eyes fixed on the display shoe in his hand, trying to will himself into a state of calm. He felt a presence behind him and knew without turning that it was Deborah. She had followed him to the front of the store, her silent surveillance now become an open escort. She stood close to close, her body language radiating suspicion and hostility. "Can I help you with something?" Terence asked, his voice carefully neutral. Deborah's lips tightened. "I'm just observing," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "We've had a lot of theft in this department lately." The implication was clear. Terence felt a flush of anger rise up his neck, but he pushed it down. He would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He would not become the angry black man she so clearly expected him to be. "I'm about to pay for this," he said, holding up the shoe. "So, you can observe all you want." He turned back to the checkout line, which had finally cleared. He stepped forward, placing the shoe on the counter. The cashier, a young man with acne and a bored expression, scanned the barcode without looking up. "That'll be $149.99, the cashier said. Terence reached for his wallet, pulling out his debit card. He was about to insert it into the card reader when Deborah's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Don't," she said. "Don't let him pay." The cashier froze, his hand hovering over the register. "What?" "I said don't let him pay," Deborah repeated, stepping forward. "That shoe is stolen." Terence spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I just took it off the shelf. It's a display shoe. I was bringing it up here to ask for a pair in my son's size." Deborah's face twisted into a sneer. "That's what they all say. I've been watching you. You've been acting suspicious since you walked in. You probably slipped that shoe into your bag when you thought no one was looking." Terence looked down at himself. He wasn't carrying a bag. He had his wallet in one hand and nothing else. The absurdity of the accusation was so profound that for a moment, he couldn't even formulate a response. "I don't have a bag," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "I'm holding the shoe in my hand. How could I have stolen it?" "You could have hidden it on your person," Deborah said, her voice rising. "You could have switched the tags. There are 100 ways to steal from a store, and you people know them all." "You people," Terence repeated, the words hanging in the air like a foul odor. The cashier looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Terence and Deborah. Deborah, I don't think." "Call Rick," Deborah interrupted, her voice now shrill. "Call the store manager. Now." The cashier hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. Terence stood frozen, the debit card still clutched in his hand, the display shoe still sitting on the counter. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, a surreal parallel universe where the normal rules of logic and decency had been suspended. A few minutes later, a man in a slightly nicer polo shirt emerged from a door marked "Employees Only." He was tall, with slick-back hair and a fake tan that made his teeth look unnaturally white. His name tag read Rick, store manager. He was white, of course. "What's the problem here?" Rick asked, his voice smooth and professional. Deborah launched into her story, her words tumbling out in a breathless rush. She described Terence's suspicious behavior, his furtive glances, his obvious intent to steal. She painted a picture of a man up to no good, a man who had come into the store with criminal intentions. Rick listened, his face a mask of concern. He nodded along, making sympathetic noises. Then he turned to Terence, and his expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to my office," he said. "We need to get this sorted out." Terence shook his head, his jaw tight with fury. "I'm not going anywhere. I've done nothing wrong. I was trying to buy a pair of shoes for my son, and this woman has been harassing me since I walked in. I want to speak to your regional manager. I want to speak to corporate. I want to speak to someone who isn't a racist piece of—" "Sir, calm down," Rick said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "There's no need for that kind of language. We're just trying to get to the bottom of this." "Get to the bottom of what?" Terence demanded. "There's nothing to get to the bottom of. I have money in my hand. I was about to pay." "Ask the cashier. Ask anyone." Rick glanced at the cashier, who shrugged helplessly. "He was about to pay, I think. I don't really know. I wasn't paying attention." The admission was infuriating. The one person who could have verified Terence's innocence had been too oblivious to notice what was happening right in front of him. "Look," Rick said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "I understand you're upset, but we have a responsibility to protect our merchandise. Deborah is one of our most experienced associates, and if she says she saw something suspicious, we have to take that seriously. Why don't you just come with me to the office, and we can review the security footage together? If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." Terrence looked at Rick, at Deborah, at the cashier. He saw the whole ugly machinery of the situation laid out before him. The assumptions, the biases, the institutional weight that was already tilting against him. He knew that if he went to that office, he would be walking into a trap. He would be the suspect, the problem, the one who had to prove his innocence to people who had already decided he was guilty. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Terrence said, his voice low and steady. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm calling my wife. I'm calling my lawyer. And I'm not moving from this spot until one of them gets here." He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. He could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on him, could hear the whispers starting to ripple through the store. He knew what they were thinking, what they were seeing. A big black man causing a scene, arguing with the manager. The narrative was already being written, and he was the villain in it. Rick sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, I'm going to have to call the police." The words hit Terrence like a physical blow. "The police? The ones whose very presence could call them," Terrence said, his voice shaking. "Call the police. Let them see how ridiculous this is. Let them see what you're doing to me for trying to buy a pair of shoes." Rick's jaw tightened. He pulled out his own phone and began to dial. Deborah stood beside him, her arms crossed, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had won. She had put the black man in his place. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers, who walked through the front doors with the casual authority of men who owned the place. "We have a potential shoplifting incident. This individual," he gestured toward Terrence, "was observed by our associate taking merchandise without paying for it." "That's a lie," Terrence shouted, the words bursting from him. "I was about to pay. I have my debit card right here. I was standing at the register when this woman started accusing me of things I didn't do." The younger officer's eyes narrowed, his posture tensing. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and calm down." "I am calm," Terrence yelled, his voice anything but. "I am being falsely accused, and I have a right to defend myself." The older officer stepped forward, his hand now on his holster. "Sir, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. Why don't you just tell us what happened?" Terrence took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He told his story, from the moment he entered the store to the moment Deborah accused him of theft. He explained about his son, about the basketball camp, about the specific shoe he was trying to buy. He showed them his debit card, his driver's license, his contractor's license. He offered to let them search him, to check his pockets. The officers listened, but their faces remained skeptical. They had heard it all before, 1,000 times, from 1,000 different people, and in their experience, the black man was usually lying. "Here's what we're going to do," the older officer said. "We're going to take you to the loss prevention office, and we're going to review the security footage. If it shows that you did nothing wrong, you'll be free to go. But if it shows that you took something without paying, you're going to be arrested. Do you understand?" Terrence nodded, his throat tight. He understood all too well. He was being given a chance to prove his innocence, but the burden of proof was on him. He was guilty until proven innocent, and the system was rigged against him. They walked him through the store, a police officer on either side, Deborah trailing behind like a vulture waiting for a carcass. The other shoppers parted to let them pass, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Terrence kept his head up, his shoulders back, refusing to look like a criminal. But inside, he was crumbling. The loss prevention office was a small, windowless room at the back of the store. There was a desk with a computer monitor, a couple of chairs, and a wall of security monitors, showing grainy footage from cameras positioned throughout the store. The older officer sat down at the desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Show me the footage from the basketball shoe section," he said to Rick. Rick pulled up the footage, and they all watched as the screen displayed a time-stamped view of the shoe op. Terrence appeared on screen, walking into the frame, scanning the shelves. He saw himself reach for the shoe, examine it, and then turn to leave. "See," Deborah said, her voice triumphant. He took the shoe and walked away without paying. "Keep watching," Terrence said, his voice strained. "I was walking to the register. That's where I was going." The footage continued. It showed Terrence walking toward the front of the store, the shoe in his hand. It showed him standing in line, waiting patiently. It showed him stepping up to the register and placing the shoe on the counter. "Look," Terrence said, pointing at the screen. "I was about to pay. I was standing right there." But the footage didn't show him paying. It showed him standing at the register, his debit card in his hand. And then it showed Deborah rushing up, her arms waving, her mouth moving in what was clearly a frantic accusation. The older officer paused the footage. "This doesn't prove anything," he said. "He could have been planning to pay with a stolen card, or he could have been trying to distract the cashier while an accomplice stole something else." The younger officer nodded in agreement. "Happens all the time. They work in teams." Terrence stared at them, his mind reeling. They were twisting the evidence, contorting it to fit their preconceived narrative. The footage showed him doing exactly what he said he was doing, but they were refusing to see it. They were determined to find him guilty, no matter what the facts said. "I was paying with my own card," Terrence said, his voice cracking. "I can show you my bank statement. I have money in my account. I'm a contractor. I make good money." "Then why were you so nervous?" The younger officer. "Why were you acting so suspicious?" "I wasn't nervous," Terrence insisted. "I was being followed around the store by a racist employee who decided I was a thief before I even opened my mouth." The older officer held up his hand. "Sir, let's not use that kind of language. We're just trying to get to the truth here." The interrogation continued for another hour. They asked him the same questions over and over, trying to trip him up, trying to find inconsistencies in his story. They asked about his criminal record, his employment history, his family life. They treated him like a suspect in a major crime, not a customer who had been falsely accused of stealing a pair of shoes. Through it all, Terrence maintained his innocence. He answered every question honestly and completely. He didn't waver, didn't contradict himself, didn't give them anything to use against him. But it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds. Finally, the older officer stood up. "I think we have enough to go on," he said. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come down to the station with us for further questioning." Terrence felt the floor drop out from under him. "What? No, you can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong. We just need to ask you a few more questions," the younger officer said, his hand moving to his handcuff. "It won't take long." Terrence stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He thought about his son, waiting for his new sneakers. He thought about his daughter, her art project half finished. He thought about his wife, who would be worried sick when he didn't come home on time. He thought about everything he had worked for, everything he had built, and he saw it all about to be taken away from him because a white woman had looked at him and seen a threat. Just as the younger officer was about to place the handcuffs on his wrists, the door to the loss prevention office burst open. A young woman in a Victory Sports uniform rushed in, her face flushed and her breathing ragged. Her name tag read Maya, and she looked like she had been running. "Wait," she shouted. "Wait, stop. You've got the wrong guy." Everyone in the room froze. The younger officer's hands hovered in midair, the handcuffs dangling uselessly. Rick and Deborah exchanged confused glances. The older officer turned to face the newcomer, his expression one of annoyed surprise. "What's going on?" he demanded. Maya was bent over, gasping for breath. She held up her phone, the screen glowing in the dim light of the office. "I have proof," she said between breaths. "I have proof he didn't do it." She walked over to the computer monitor and began tapping on the keyboard. "There's another camera angle," she explained. "The one in the checkout area. It shows everything. I just saw the footage." He was about to pay. He had his card in the machine. Deborah stopped him before he could finish. She pulled up a new video feed, and the room fell silent as they watched. The footage was clearer than the first angle, the camera positioned directly above the checkout counter. It showed Terrence placing the shoe on the counter, showed the cashier scanning it, showed Terrence inserting his debit card into the card reader. Then it showed Deborah rushing up, her arms waving, her mouth forming words that were now clearly audible, thanks to the better microphone placement. "Don't let him pay." Deborah's voice rang out, tinny but unmistakable. "That shoe is stolen." The footage continued to play, showing the confrontation in vivid detail. It showed Terrence's confusion, his anger, his frustration. It showed Deborah's smug satisfaction, her obvious pleasure at having disrupted the transaction. It showed the arrival of the police, the escort to the loss prevention office, the entire ugly scene laid bare. When the footage ended, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of what they had all just witnessed. Terrence stood there, his wrists still uncuffed, his body shaking with a mixture of relief and fury. The older officer cleared his throat, his face reddening. "Well," he said, his voice gruff, "it appears there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Terrence's voice was a roar of pent-up rage. "You were about to arrest me. You were about to put me in handcuffs and take me to jail for buying a pair of shoes because that woman," he pointed at Deborah, "decided I was a criminal because of the color of my skin. And you call that a misunderstanding?" The younger officer had the decency to look ashamed. He holstered his handcuffs, his eyes fixed on the floor. The older officer stood up straight, his jaw tight, his expression one of stubborn defensiveness. "Sir, I understand you're upset," he said, "but we were just doing our jobs. We received a report of a theft, and we responded accordingly." "You responded by treating me like a criminal," Terrence shot back. "You didn't ask for my side of the story. You didn't look at the evidence. You just assumed I was guilty because I'm black and she's white. That's not doing your job. That's racism, plain and simple." Rick stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Washington, I want to apologize on behalf of Victory Sports. This is not how we do business. I can assure you that we will be conducting a full investigation into this incident, and appropriate action will be taken." Terrence turned to face him, his eyes blazing. "Appropriate action?" "The appropriate action would have been to let me buy the damn shoes and go home to my family. But instead, you let your employee harass me, accuse me, and almost get me arrested. You stood there and watched it happen. You're just as guilty as she is." He turned to Deborah, who had retreated to a corner of the room, her face pale, and her earlier smugness completely evaporated. "And you," he said, his voice cold and hard, "you did this because you hate black people. You looked at me and saw a threat, a criminal, someone who didn't belong in your store. You didn't see a father trying to buy shoes for his son. You didn't see a man with a job and a family and a life. You saw a stereotype, and you tried to destroy me because of it." Deborah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked small and pathetic, a cornered animal caught in her own trap. Terrence turned back to the officers. "I want this documented," he said. "I want a copy of that footage. I want the names and badge numbers of every officer who was involved in this, and I want to speak to my lawyer." He pulled out his phone and began to dial, his fingers still shaking. As the phone rang, he looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had been so ready to condemn him. He saw the embarrassment, the defensiveness, the dawning realization of what they had almost done. But he also saw something else, something that had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface. He saw the truth. He saw the system for what it was, a machine designed to protect some and punish others, to uphold the status quo and crush anyone who dared to challenge it. He saw the racism that was woven into the very fabric of American life, invisible to those who benefited from it, but all too real to those who lived under its shadow. The phone connected, and a familiar voice came on the line. Angela Davis's office. How can I help you? Terrence took a deep breath, steadying himself. This is Terrence Washington, he said. I need to speak to Angela. It's an emergency. As he waited for his lawyer to come on the line, Terrence looked out the small window of the loss prevention office, at the parking lot beyond, at the cars driving past on the road, at the world going about its business as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something profound and ugly and all too familiar. He had been reminded, once again, that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, no matter how good a man he tried to be, he would always be seen first as black, and everything else second. He would always be the suspect, the threat, the one who had to prove his humanity to people who would never fully see it. The fight was far from over, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he would not back down. He would not be silenced. He would not be broken. He was a survivor, and he would keep surviving, no matter what they threw at him, for himself, for his family, for every black man and woman who had ever been told that they didn't belong. The voice of his lawyer came on the line, sharp and professional. Terrence, what's going on? He took one last look at the room, at the faces of his accusers, and he began to speak. You're not going to believe this, he said, but I almost just got arrested for trying to buy a pair of shoes. The story poured out of him, every detail, every humiliation, every moment of fear and rage. And as he spoke, he felt something shift inside him, a hardening of his resolve, a strengthening of his spirit. He was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was a man who was ready to fight back. The legal battle would be long and exhausting, but Terrence Washington was prepared for it. He had been preparing for it his whole life, whether he knew it or not. He had been preparing for the day when the system would come for him, and he had always known that when that day came, he would stand his ground. He was done being the victim. He was done being the suspect. He was done being the one who had to apologize for existing. From now on, he was the one who would be asking the questions, and he was going to make damn sure that the answers were heard. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal consultations, media requests, and community meetings. Angela Davis, his lawyer, had taken the case pro bono, recognizing in Terrence's story the same pattern of racial injustice that she had dedicated her career to fighting. They demanded the security footage, which Maya had helpfully copied before anyone could accidentally delete it. The footage was damning, showing with brutal clarity the entire sequence of events. It showed Terrence's patience, his composure, his willingness to cooperate. It showed Deborah's hostility, her obvious bias, her eagerness to escalate the situation. It showed the police officers' quickness to believe the white accuser and their slowness to consider the black victim's perspective. The story went viral almost immediately. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets. The hashtag Justice for Terrence trended on social media. Celebrities and politicians weighed in, expressing their outrage and demanding accountability. Victory Sports, which had initially tried to downplay the incident, was forced to issue a public apology and announce a comprehensive review of their anti-discrimination policies. Deborah, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. Her social media accounts were deleted. Her phone number changed, her apartment reportedly vacated. But the internet, as it always does, found her. Anonymous users dug up her past, her public records, her old blog posts, her comments on local news sites. What they found was a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Deborah had a history of making false accusations against people of color. She had called the police on a black family having a barbecue in a public park. She had reported a Latino man for suspicious behavior in a grocery store, only for it to turn out that he was shopping for his elderly mother. She had left a string of hostile comments on social media posts about racial justice, using language that was unambiguous in its bigotry. The picture that emerged was of a woman consumed by racial resentment, a woman who saw herself as a victim of a changing world and who lashed out at the people she blamed for her perceived decline. She was, in the words of one commentator, a one-woman crime wave of racial animosity. But the most shocking revelation came from a former co-worker of Deborah's, a woman named Karen who had worked with her at a previous job at a department store. Karen, who asked to be identified only by her first name, gave an interview to a local news station that blew the case wide open. Deborah had a thing for black men, Karen said, her face pale and her voice trembling. She would talk about them all the time, about how exotic they were, about how she wanted to experience one of them. It was disturbing, honestly. She seemed to think of them as objects, not people. Karen continued, her story becoming more detailed and more damning. There was one guy in particular, a customer who used to come in regularly. He was tall, good-looking, always dressed nice. Deborah was obsessed with him. She would find excuses to talk to him, to be near him. She even looked up his address on the store's customer database, which was totally against policy. The interviewer leaned in, sensing the weight of what Karen was about to reveal. What happened? Karen took a deep breath. One day, she finally worked up the courage to ask him out. She had been building up to it for weeks, talking about how she was going to make her move. She cornered him in the shoe department, all dolled up, and she asked him if he wanted to get a drink sometime. And he turned her down, politely. From what I heard, he said he was married, that he was flattered but not interested. Karen paused, shaking her head. Deborah was devastated, but she was also furious. She came back to the break room and started ranting about how ungrateful he was, how they never appreciate what we offer them. She said he was going to regret rejecting her. She said she would make him regret it. The interviewer's voice was hushed. Did she ever say what she meant by that? Karen nodded slowly. She said she knew how to put them in their place. She said all she had to do was make one phone call, and he would be back in the streets where he belongs. I didn't think she was serious at the time. I thought she was just venting. But now I think she was telling us exactly what she was capable of. The interview was a bombshell. It transformed the story from a case of racial profiling to a calculated act of revenge. Deborah, it seemed, had not simply mistaken Terence for a thief. She had targeted him, deliberately and maliciously, because he had rejected her romantic advances. The revelation sparked a new wave of outrage. Protesters gathered outside Victory Sports stores across the country, demanding justice for Terence and an end to the systemic racism that had allowed this to happen. Politicians called for investigations, for new legislation, for a reckoning with the deep-seated biases that infected American institutions. Through it all, Terence tried to maintain his focus on his family. He shielded Jordan and his daughter from the worst of the media storm, trying to preserve some semblance of normalcy in their lives. But it was impossible. Everywhere he went, he was recognized. Every conversation he had, every stranger he met, the topic inevitably turned to the incident. He became a symbol, a spokesperson for a movement he had never asked to join. He was invited to speak at rallies, to appear on talk shows, to write op-eds for major newspapers. He accepted some of these invitations, feeling a sense of obligation to use his platform for good. But he also felt a deep weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from being constantly reminded of the worst day of his life. One evening, after a particularly draining day of interviews and meetings, Terence sat on the back porch of his modest suburban home, watching the sun set over the neatly trimmed lawns of his neighborhood. His wife Felicia joined him, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. "You okay?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Terence took a long sip of the tea, the cool sweetness soothing his parched throat. "I don't know," he admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm making a difference, like something good might actually come out of this. Other days I just feel tired, like I'm fighting a battle I can't win. Alicia reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. You're not fighting alone, she said. You have me. You have the kids. You have a whole community behind you. And you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for Jordan, for every black child who deserves to grow up in a world where they're not automatically seen as a threat. Terence nodded, his eyes fixed on the fading light. I know that's true, but sometimes I wonder if it's ever going to be enough. If anything we do is ever going to change the way people see us. It's not about changing everyone, Alicia said. It's about changing the system. It's about making sure that the next time Deborah tries to use the police as her personal weapon, she doesn't get away with it. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter who they are or what they look like. Terence squeezed her hand. You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard. You know, sometimes I just want to go back to being a regular guy, a contractor who fixes drywall and coaches his son's basketball team. I didn't ask for any of this. None of us asked for it, Alicia said. But it found us anyway, and we have a choice. We can let it break us, or we can let it make us stronger. I choose stronger. I choose to fight. And I know you do too. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted through the warm evening air, the distant bark of a dog, the laughter of children, the soft hum of a lawnmower in the distance. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity, a picture of the American dream. But Terence knew that for people like him, that dream was always fragile, always under threat. The legal case against Deborah and Victory Sports was still ongoing, but the evidence was overwhelming. Deborah had been arrested and charged with filing a false police report and obstruction of justice. She faced the possibility of jail time, though her lawyers were angling for a plea deal that would keep her out of prison. Victory Sports had offered Terence a substantial settlement, which he was considering, though he was also pushing for broader changes to the company's policies and practices. As the weeks turned into months, the story began to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer outrages, fresher tragedies. But for Terence, the impact would never fade. He carried the scars of that day with him, invisible but ever present, a reminder of the fragility of his freedom, the contingency of his safety, the constant vigilance required to navigate a world that saw him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. He returned to work, his hands once again coated with drywall dust, his days filled with the satisfying labor of building and repairing. He returned to his family, to the daily rituals of dinner and homework and bedtime stories. He returned to his life, but he was not the same man who had walked into Victory Sports that hot summer afternoon. He was harder now, more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. He watched the news with a new sense of personal investment, every story of racial injustice a painful reminder of his own experience. He spoke more openly about racism, refusing to stay silent in the face of ignorance and hate, and he held his son a little tighter, whispered a few extra words of encouragement, taught him the lessons that had been taught to him by his own father, the lessons about how to survive in a world that didn't always see his humanity. One day, as he was picking Jordan up from basketball practice, his son turned to him with a serious expression on his face. "Dad," Jordan said, "why do people hate us?" Terence felt his heart clench. He had been dreading this question, knowing that it would come eventually, knowing that he would have to find the words to explain the inexplicable. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face his son, his eyes meeting Jordan's with a directness that conveyed both love and honesty. "Not everyone hates us," he said carefully, "but some people do. Some people are afraid of what they don't understand. They look at the color of our skin, and they see something different, something threatening. They've been taught to believe that we're less than they are, and they act on that belief, even if they don't realize they're doing it." Jordan nodded slowly, his young face processing the weight of his father's words. But why? What did we ever do to